Welcome everybody to this third day of the EFDRR. We will start the plenary session on Every Life Counts, inclusive and equality-based DRR strategies. And I'm very pleased that we have such a distinguished panel here, and we will have additional keynote speakers. Why this session is very important? Because it's really at the heart of what the DRR community stands. So saving life, protecting life is really at the core of what we do. And it will be an interesting session because we'll speak about this amazing ability of humans to create visions, strategies and plans that allow people and institutions to collaborate in order to face the challenges ahead that we have. And they are not to underestimate. Humankind knocks at the planetary boundaries, and, for example, biodiversity is shrinking fast. Animals are extinct without that we exactly know why. Climate change is accelerating and intensifying disasters, and we have to confront those challenges. We are not here with empty hands. There are the global visions, there is the SDGs that call for protection of nature on Earth and below sea. There is a Paris Agreement that urges us to keep the 1.5 degrees global warming, or for sure below 2 degrees. And last but not least, there is the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction that provides us with opportunities to come together, to speak together, to give life to those visions and plans and strategies. At national level, there are many examples of good DRR plans that set priorities, and at the local level, there are amazing initiatives to come together in mutual solidarity. But those strategies, visions and plans, they have to pass actually two tests. They have to be simple, they have to be understood at once so that people can act upon them. They have to move the hearts and the brains of people, and they have to mobilize the resources and policies of governments. And second, they have to reach out to the people. They have to reach to the most vulnerable and to include them, as every life counts. That's why we will look and test those strategies and plans at the different levels if they live up to those two criteria. I would like now to give the word to the very first keynote speaker. He's coming from Italy, Mr. Alexander Virgili. He lives in Neapel and he studies at the University of Naples Federico II. Since he's 16 years old, a civil protection volunteer, and now he's a coordinator. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Buongiorno a tutti.
Good morning, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank the Office of the United Nations for Disaster Risk Reduction for involving youth in this very interesting forum, and for inviting me as a representative of United Nations Major Group for Children and Youth. During the last 7 years, I have been committed to create a resilient community where I live. As I live in a very difficult area and quite challenging, actually, I have, together with other young people living in that same area, we are trying to implement the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. The Major Group for Children and Youth of the United Nations is the dedicated space for young people and children of the United Nations to be involved in the decision-making process of the UN. The aim of this group is to create a bridge between youth and the UN system. Of course, we try to do that in informal and formal context, also following the implementation and monitoring of laws and regulations that are sustainable and that can contribute to the lives of all. As I said before, I am from a very difficult area and challenging territory. I always knew that I live in a very difficult place. I live between those two red zones, Campi Flegrei and Vesuvio, and I wanted to give my contribution to reduce disaster risk. I became a volunteer and I enrolled in a volunteer organization of civil protection. And I've always known that my area, my territory is very fragile, and my activity in the civil protection is indeed between those two red zones, which are the most fragile, most dangerous and risky areas in Italy and Europe. Doing this civil protection activity as volunteers, we can give support to major events and meetings with other organizations. We also do prevention activities in school. When we go to school, what is always clear is that young people are very interested in these topics. And even though sometimes we don't feel involved in the decision-making process regarding strategies, of course, all young people are indeed interested in those topics. I have never met a boy or a girl that wasn't interested in the disaster risk strategy. So not involving young people in this decision-making process, for example, in my city, means not involving 35% of the population. So more than 1/3 of those to which these strategies are destined. So increasing awareness of risk at a very young age is fundamental. I believe that youth engagement is fundamental as well, because we have to realize that young people are an integral part of the society, and this can make a difference. Of course, I am not only speaking about just young people, but those people that can contribute in implementing valid strategies for disaster risk reduction. Resilient communities cannot exist if youth is not involved. Just to conclude, I would like to make an example. An example of a girl, 11 years old. She's English and she's on vacation with her family. She studied in school that when the sea retracts, probably there's going to be a tsunami. So she warned her dad and all the people who were present at the beach, and then she, in the end, saved many people. That doesn't mean that young people must have to be informed just because they have to be informed, but because they can have an active role in that. So thank you very much for your attention.
We would continue with the second keynote speaker, and as I have told at the beginning, let's look at if we really include the most vulnerable person. That's why I asked the panelists to bring with them a so-called fictive persona that is most at risk in their contexts. And the persona that the two colleagues from Sweden, Minna Bodin, who works at the Swedish Civil Contingency Agency called MSB, and she's as well the focal point for the Sendai framework, and Mr. Erland Hedin, who is a forestry owner in Sweden that endured losses during the last fire. That persona is an elderly person living in a small village in Sweden in the forests. Youth have already left those villages for urban centers. The biggest risk that this person faces are forestry fire, and she may lose her house and her assets. But she will not only lose kind of material things that are maybe insured, but she will as well lose the environment she lived and was used to. She will lose a feeling of belonging to the place she knew before very well. If her capacities to respond are really captured in the system, we will hear. And with these words, I would like my colleagues to come to the mic.
So thank you very much. Thank you and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This year, the fire season in Sweden was exceptional in many ways. The weather conditions were extreme, and the fire risk level remained very high across the whole country from May until August. Late May, MSB issued a national warning message for high levels of forest fire risk. This is a map of Sweden with all reported forest fires this period. It's about 300, so it's quite a lot for us. The total size of the burnt area was also exceptional this year. Over 22,000 hectares. It's almost twice the size as the big forest fires in 2014. This summer, we also received help, assistance from many countries like Denmark, Finland, France, Germany, Italy, Lithuania, Norway, Poland, and Portugal. Most of this through the EU Civil Protection Mechanism. And thank you again for all that assistance. It really made a difference. We have learned from our experience with the fires. Some national agencies have already reported to the government how to improve our capacity. But one thing we know is the importance of cooperation between the stakeholders. To cooperate, you need knowledge and understanding of the other's perspective. So, I will now welcome Mr. Erland Hedin. He is a representative of the Swedish forestry sector, and he was personally affected by these fires this summer. So, Erland.
Thank you very much. So it doesn't work? Okay. So I'm a forest owner in the central of Sweden. My forest, about 100 hectares, was destroyed by the fire in the summer of 2019. I'm going to tell you a little about my experiences during the fires and afterwards. These are my experiences as an owner of a forested land and as a financial business advisor for farmers and forest landowners. To own a forest in Sweden, you have a lot of reasons to do it. It's a cultural heritage, it's for recreation, walking, skiing, and so on. It's for hunting. Mushroom and berries are picked there to preserve biodiversity, and the most important reason is my family's own economy. On the 14th of July, after a long period of drought, a thunderstorm struck the area and started several fires in the forests. After a couple of days, the fire had spread throughout the area and my forest was burning. I could not do anything about it. The area was, the only information I got was from radio and internet. It was quite frustrated to sit at home and not to be able to do anything about it. I wanted to be in the forest and try to fight the fire. But the firefighters did not allow anyone else than themselves to be in the forest because of the danger of the fires. The municipality of Ljusdal, where the forest is located in the middle of Sweden. It's a big municipality. It's about 5,600 square kilometers, big area, and it's 90% of its area is covered by forest. When the fire started, the conditions were drier than ever. There was no lake, river, or anything natural that could break the path of the fire. And in Ljusdal, there are less than 20 firefighters in the fire brigade. In the area, there are some small villages. There mostly elderly residents are living. But we got a lot of help. A lot of volunteers was assisted in the operation to give the firefighters the opportunity to concentrate on the firefighting. So we were a lot of people working with supplying with food and sleeping facilities and so on. Many people from all over Sweden and from all over Europe was helping us with equipment such as aircraft, helicopters, trucks, tractors, manure containers, etc., etc. and with a lot of people. At last, the fire was extinguished. During the fire and afterwards, we as a landowner, forest owner, got a lot of information from national government, the county government, the municipality, and so on. But all the time I felt that this is my forest, I want to see it myself and see what's happening. It makes me more calm and I can start thinking about what to do now. I want to see it if it is as bad as they are telling us, or is it even worse, or maybe better. It's dangerous to be in the forest after the burn, that the fire is gone. All the trees are standing quite, and not falling trees all over the place. So we have some safety course before we had the opportunity to take a trip out in the burned forests. The first time I was out there, it was terrible to see, but good to have seen. We all started thinking about how we can stop a fire early on the next time it burns and how to make ourselves less vulnerable. Before the next fire, we have to learn from these fires and really take steps to prevent mistakes from these fires and earlier fires too. It's important to give early warnings and a big contribution from all different parts of firefighters at the first alarm. The locals are the best one to know the area. Listen to their advice. They can guide you in the area. They know the roads. They often have quite a lot of knowledge of firefighting in the forests. Have them to work with those who are leading the firefighting teams. The farmers and other entrepreneurs are also very important to have involved from the very beginning. They have the right equipment, they are used to working hard and long hours. They know the area very well and often better than the firefighters. Contact with the insurance company is important early on. What's in it for me? It's a big loss of all the values I mentioned in the beginning of this talk. The insurance will take care of most of it. And the forest or farmer owner, if the forest and farmer owner has insurance, and luckily in Sweden, most of us have it. What more can we learn about these summer forest fires in Sweden that we do better next time? Well, we need early warning systems. Surveillance planes should be more frequent. The earlier discover the fire, the better it is. Small fire, it's small problems. Big fire is big problems. If there is a big risk, then you need high preparedness. Well, the big risk that it's really dry in the area. Do not use logging machinery when the fire risk is high. The sparks could cause a fire. Check your equipment. Have an organization on alert, not just the firefighters. As we say in Sweden, be on your toes. All the roads in the forest should be signposted and in good conditions, so the fire crews can get where they are going quickly. Provide information to residents and allow the possibility of their participation so that they can help. When the fire is extinguished, the landowners are responsible for the bywatch for the days and weeks depending on the weather condition. It has to be organized in a better way. We have a lot of old landowners and a lot of landowners living far from the forest, and they can't work watching the land after a fire is extinguished. And it's really important to inform all the tourists about the risk when it's really dry. To the left on this picture, out of the scene you have seen, it's just black forest. I want to face this side of the lake and look forward where there's a green growing forest again. But today there are still a lot of questions not answered. How about the insurance money? Is that covering all the problems I have and all the values I have lost? How to clear the land and plant for new forest? We know it's working, but we don't really know how. What about the extra money the government promised us? We haven't seen them yet, and we really don't know how they are coming. And it's a lot more of questions. So we are having a lot of meetings at home, all the landowners, and discussing this and trying to straighten out all the questions we have. So thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Mr. Erland Hedin, for this very impressive presentation from fires in forestries of Sweden. We will now change to England, and I would like to introduce to you Ms. Kirsty Bagnall. She's the policy officer working at Ambition for Aging in Greater Manchester. And she brought with her another persona at risk, and that's Razia. She's a 74-year-old Pakistani woman, and she's not confident speaking English, even so she lives since years there. She lives with her husband and son in a deprived area in Greater Manchester with a high population of South Asian people. She lives in an old traditional housing that was built in a floodplain without flood resistance measures, and she has no insurance. Her capacity to prevent and respond depends on the support she receives from her family and community, as she may not easily understand early warnings and messages about what to do due to language barriers. So she may have greater difficulties accessing support packages after a flooding. Normally, she would not be included in DRR strategy and will not be part of designing delivery packages. But let's listen to Kirsty Bagnall. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today, share with you some of the work we're doing in Greater Manchester, which is in the north-west of England. I'm based at a charity called GMCVO on a project called Ambition for Aging. We've been working in partnership with our colleagues in local government to feed older people's voices into our DRR processes and strategies. As Ambition for Aging, we want to know what works in reducing social isolation amongst older people. And we do this by working with them to ask what an age-friendly community looks like and what the barriers are to achieving it. We believe that an age-friendly city is a resilient city, where older people are connected to their communities, they stay healthy and active for longer, bringing with them a number of strengths that can be beneficial during times when they have to deal with disasters. But these need to be recognised in DRR planning. To support the creation of Greater Manchester's resilience strategy, we carried out research with our older people into how they acted in emergencies and what they needed before, during and after times of shock. We know that older people can be particularly vulnerable during disasters, facing additional barriers due to individual mobility, a lack of income, loneliness, or due to social isolation by being disconnected from their communities. For older people who are socially isolated but not receiving support, there is a risk to their levels of resilience. However, we also know that older people have many strengths that can help them prepare for shocks. This can include the ability to draw on experience, resources, relationship building skills, for example, to prepare themselves and to support others during emergencies. With the right support, older people can and should play a role in disaster planning processes. As part of this work in Greater Manchester, to ensure that we hear from older people as we develop our strategy, I spoke directly with a number of older people to feed into the work. I'd like to share with you some of the points from these conversations and what they mean for resilience planning in Greater Manchester. So, Razia's story is loosely based on a group of women I spoke to in Oldham, which is in the northeast of Greater Manchester, together with discussions I had with workers in bordering Rochdale. I chose to speak to members from marginalised groups, as we know that from previous research that the more marginalising traits a person has, the more likely they are to be socially isolated. And tight-knit communities are often built around common experiences of marginalisation. The older people I've spoken to have experienced floods, riots and fires, but had also experienced racism, poverty, discrimination. And their experiences of the latter shape their actions and ability to bounce back during and after the former. The group of South Asian women I spoke to all shared a common language and a common culture. They spoke about supporting each other during times of shock, whether that's a shock to their community, such as a neighbourhood shooting, or something more large-scale, such as the Oldham race riots in 2001. A common theme that came across from all the older people I spoke to was how an individual's connections to community and family played a large role in developing and maintaining their resilience. A sense of camaraderie during disasters and the ability to support each other emotionally. These connections, or bonding social capital, showcase the strength in these marginalised communities. However, marginalised people may not have access to resources other groups have. They often lack the connections needed to reach outside of their own immediate social network, known as bridging social capital. And it is these connections that allow individuals to move on from that reciprocal support between friends and family to the ability to access information and outside support. Through building the needs of older people into resilience planning and recognising the countless different experiences and intersecting characteristics amongst older people, we in Greater Manchester are working together to look towards delivering inclusive DRR strategies. We're looking at the importance of bridging organisations such as social clubs, charities, the voluntary sector, and individuals such as community leaders in resilience planning. These are those who are working with older people in their day-to-day lives and who, come times of trouble, are the first place many people will turn to. Having strong relationships with these people and organisations is one way of ensuring that the most vulnerable older people are not left out during disasters. And this is at all levels, between planners, emergency services and day-to-day service providers alongside those older people. Including these connections within our planning means that we can start to understand how these relationships work and, as a result, how we can best meet the needs of our diverse population of older people. More than this, working with these organisations and the older people they support to form plans at a strategic level is imperative. Through this partnership with local government, we've been working closely to bring the views of older people who are at risk of extreme social isolation and therefore more at risk during disasters, with those planning at a strategic level to ensure that the plans in place to support them are inclusive at all levels. Working with marginalised people has shown us time and time again that viewing all older people as the same is not practical when designing interventions. In doing so, we risk making existing inequalities worse. The reason we as a charity are feeding into Greater Manchester's strategy is to help bring older people's voices to that level. We know that the definition of who is vulnerable in an emergency is very difficult, and that simple things can be catastrophic. We know, for example, if the water supply is shut down and people are given bottled water, some may not be able to unscrew lids. But it's so important to recognise that older people have a number of strengths that can be drawn from during and after disasters. The strength within communities cannot be understated. It's about recognising these connections and utilising them during times of disaster. And I'm not only talking about older people who have traditional strengths, such as being physically fit. Many older people have the knowledge on how to deal with certain shocks when they've experienced them before. Previous life experience and a belief in persistence can also add to an individual's resilience. When we talk about including older people's voices in resilience and disaster planning, we're talking about a big picture. We're not only talking about regional strategy, but about recognising the risks and strengths in different areas and from different people. Think back to the example of Razia and her friends. She has many strengths that allow her to be an actor within the development and maintenance of her own community's resilience. She has many connections within her immediate community. She can offer emotional support, not only to her peers, but to young people, her children, her grandchildren too. With support from strategists, she can be linked into plans via leaders in her community. She can be better informed about what to expect during times of shock if information is provided in a language that she understands by people who are close to her. By understanding the needs of older people at a local level, we can develop our designs around them to develop truly inclusive DRR governance strategies and plans. Thank you.
We got now 2 examples of the local level and how important it is to include the different stakeholders at the local level before, during and after disaster strikes. I would like now to turn to our distinguished government representative, Minister Rustam Nazarzoda. He is the head of the Committee of Emergency Situation and Civil Defence. Please, you could, yeah. Please.
Dear Mr. Chairperson, dear ladies and gentlemen, with your permission, I would like to welcome you this important international event on behalf of the delegation of the Republic of Tajikistan and express my gratitude to the government of Italy and organizers for inviting me to participate in this work. Natural disasters are one of the main factors affecting social and economic development of any country. By reducing disaster risks, we do not only accelerate the development process, but also contribute to its sustainability, saving human lives. Climate change, environmental degradation, water scarcity, diseases, population growth, unplanned urbanization threaten to undermine the major development achievements. Shocks and stress factors such as conflicts, natural disasters and political instability can also have devastating consequences. Today, risk assessment is one of the important analytical tools that enables us to determine the factors for human health, the ratio, and on this basis to determine the priorities of risk mitigation activities. The Republic of Tajikistan annually faces natural, geological and hydrological phenomena such as heavy rains, floods, landslides and mudflows, heavy snowfalls and avalanches, earthquakes that cause serious damage to the population and the economy of the country. An analysis of data from the past 5 years suggests that climate change annually contributes to the rise of these natural disasters. During this period, in Tajikistan, about 800 emergency natural disasters were recorded, a result of which 144 people died, and the country's economy was damaged by more than $600 million. Mudflows accounted for 34% of the total number of natural disasters. Today, we pay special attention to the importance of inclusion in the field of disaster risk reduction within the framework of the European Forum, which undoubtedly serves as an integrated platform for discussing regional problems and priorities by providing opportunities for finding their solution. Undoubtedly, this is an important tool that can bring benefit to people and countries of the region, and firstly, it should be reflected in the national strategies according to the objectives of the Sendai Framework Programme, in accordance with the principle of our session, no one behind. The Republic of Tajikistan, within the framework of the National Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction, is taking effective measures to implement the recommendations of the Sendai Framework for Action 2015-2030. Currently, we have completed the development of a draft national strategy for the Republic of Tajikistan for disaster risk reduction for the period 2019-2030. And representatives of international organizations took an active part during that work. We are discussing at the moment a draft national strategy to support disabled and other social groups subject to risk. The draft national strategy was discussed at the meeting of the National Platform, and its final version was submitted to the government of the Republic of Tajikistan for approval. Our partners to carry out this plan give their contribution to develop the national strategy. In the Republic of Tajikistan, we have 150,000 disabled people, and of them 30,000 are children or underage people. It is especially difficult for people with disabilities that live in high mountainous remote settlements. I would like to briefly inform you about the activities of inclusive disaster risk reduction carried out over the past 2 years in the Republic of Tajikistan by the Committee for Emergency Situations and Civil Protection, together with our partners in the framework of the Dipartimento 9 and 10 programs. We've fulfilled some objectives about mountainous cities, 2,000 to 3,000 meters above the sea level. The main objective of the project is to introduce an inclusive approach in the activities and the national strategy for disaster risk reduction to ensure resilience of people in mountainous regions to natural disaster risks. The work was organized at 3 levels. The Committee for Emergency Situations and Civil Defense, the Ministry of Health and Social Protection for Population, the Ministry of Education and Science of the Republic of Tajikistan took part in the works. Particularly, we pay attention to the inclusion of women and gender equality. We elaborated a national strategy for an inclusive approach, taking into account disaster risk reduction. The main partner in this case was the Aga Khan Agency for Habitat and the Dipartimento project. More than 12 meetings have been conducted on inclusive disaster risk reduction, including the promotion of an accessible and safe environment for people with disability in accordance with standards and norms for physical and information accessibility, which is conducive to enhancing the resilience of communities to disaster risk. We carried out an information program. We educated the population. We are drafting an early warning system. And we're working on the format of information transfer, including sign language and Braille, for example. These are the main goals these were the main goals on which we focused. We carried out a training for disabled people. During this training, we paid special attention to the evacuation procedure and rescue procedures. We also paid special attention to health and temporary houses for the affected population. Moreover, we are working on accessibility of water supply and sanitation system during disasters, in particular for women and vulnerable groups like elderly people, women and disabled. 93% of our territory is mountainous. From 1,000 meters above sea level to much more. So the majority of natural disasters are connected to the mountainous land. Building on the new vision of the Sendai Framework Programme, the national strategy identifies new approaches to the role of women in disaster risk reduction, the importance of overcoming gender inequalities, along with reducing the risk of natural disasters, climate change, and sustainable development. Along with women, special attention is paid to the importance of engaging children, young people, people with disabilities, the elderly, and displaced people in the transformative process. One of the challenges of natural disaster risk reduction is poor gender mainstreaming, ignoring the fact that disasters can have different effects on men and women, and therefore women and men have specific needs and varying degrees of vulnerability. In this regard, it should be noted that gender approach was also taken into consideration in the development of the national strategy, which is supposed to be introduced at all stages of disaster risk reduction, taking into account 2 mandatory areas. First one is taking into consideration the special needs and requirements of men and women and other most at-risk groups, including persons with disabilities, the elderly, children, etc. And the second one is the engagement of women and other social groups in the processes and decision-making on all key areas. It is important to train the population and take into account the needs of children, adolescents, the elderly, and people with disabilities. The expected outcomes of the National Strategy for Disaster Risk Reduction for 2019-2030 are several. the operation of an incentive system for development and non-formal, accessible and inclusive education on disaster risk reduction for various population groups, especially vulnerable groups, as we said. The second one is ensuring the engagement of women in institutional structures and disaster management at community and national levels. The third one is increasing the participation of women, youths and people with disabilities in the development and implementation of national and local programs and plans for rehabilitation, reconstruction and development after natural disasters. At the same time, in order to implement the adopted commitments and recommendations, we need the support of international organizations in strengthening interaction between participants in order to improve inclusion as part of the national strategy for disaster risk reduction. We should work together to develop the legal aspects of interaction mechanism and establishment of working procedures, mainstreaming cooperation and communication between informal and professional stakeholders, and ensure joint use of data on all range of issues related to disaster risk reduction, as well as to expand the use of mass media to cover the entire population, including people with disabilities. So once again, we must include all these vulnerable groups. We should collaborate, and we are planning to have a conference in 2019 in the city of Dushanbe on the disaster risk reduction. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rustam Nazarzoda, for your comprehensive words about Tajikistan and enlightening, shed light on specific questions of disability and gender-inclusive strategies. With this, I would actually like to go now to the science and introduce to you Dr. Michael Staudingher from Austria. He is the focal point of the Sendai framework and he leads the Institute for Meteorology and Geodynamics. Mr. Staudingher has brought as well another very vulnerable person to this audience here. For him, the person most at risk is a farmer aged 65 working in the Alps. He has a car, but a landslide cut him off from the connection to the nearest center. Even his house was seriously damaged by a landslide. Protection measures by the state and other actors are underway, but it will take years, if not decades, to make similar locations safe due to the ongoing climate change in this area. With these words, I would like to hand over to Dr. Michael Staudingher.
And his name is Josef Unterwurzacher. And it's a real story from the southern part, from Austria, from Carinthia, where it happened in October, where farms were cut off and where landslides came down in areas where this hadn't happened for centuries before. Of course, landslides and avalanches is something very typical for Austria and happens again and again. Just the amount that occurred in the last couple of years, that changed considerably. And if you come back to Mr. Unterwurzacher, he heard about climate change, and it was something that was in the media discussed a lot, but it wouldn't really touch him, like many of us. It's something academics talk about, and you even hear voices in the media. There's other opinions as well. It might mean this, it might mean that. It was far away, and all of a sudden, it came very close. Another point to see this is me being in the preparation phase of the Sendai framework, where I've attended most of the conferences there, and we had these endless texts where we tried to agree what should be done in the framework itself. And the question I was asking myself is, how will we ever bring this to the ground? How will we ever make this work in a surrounding like Mr. Unterwurzacher, living up in the Alps, where climate change is happening on one side, but what's needed is planning and resources for protection measures which go into millions and billions in Austria, for example, which cannot so easily be invested from one day to the next. What's also needed is warning system, and what's needed is understanding the risk. What we did in Austria, and we took example from our Swedish colleagues and from other countries as well, was setting up a national platform where different sectors, different ministries would come together, different types of science would come together and discuss the things which are ahead of us in terms of climate change. To understand the risk, it needs a transdisciplinary and interdisciplinary approach. And it needs, most of all, not being an expert like me, I'm a meteorologist, but it needs listening to others and understanding what hydrologists are saying, understanding what people from zero protection are saying, what people out in the field are saying, and how to define the risk not by the natural hazard, but by vulnerability and by exposure. And this is a change of paradigm. This was a change of paradigm for most of us. And to think in these new terms was something that helped us to get closer to the problem that Mr. Josef Unterwurzacher is facing now, and his children will be facing even more in the future. Another thing, and you asked me for the most vulnerable person, and I was hesitating a little bit to answer because it's so many different types of vulnerable people we have to talk about. Because something else which came on very quick in our risk analysis, which we made, who's exposed to which type of risk and how often does it occur, and how serious can it be, was the effects of heat waves. We had a heat wave last year with temperatures reaching 42 degrees in areas where that 25 was a nice day, 30 was a very hot day, but 42 was something never you've heard about. And the yellow paper, the paper which is read the most in Austria, it had a picture on the day where you saw young people jumping in the swimming pool and saying heat wave. So the connotation was, it's not so bad, as long as you can go in a swimming pool and refresh yourself, it's no big problem. It was neglecting the situation as it really is. There's many people living in homes with no air condition, with a reduced mobility, and this is the Austrian problem in comparison to France, for example, where it's well known who's living where the rescue teams saw the problem only when it was too late. So what we did, we set up a heat warning in most of the regions, not all of them, but most of the regions in Austria now, where the rescue teams, Red Cross and other rescue teams, they have an idea who could be at risk and who needs help and what could be done before someone collapses from a heat stroke or has cardiovascular problems and so on. So this thinking about exposure and thinking about vulnerability and those people most at risk, which are well hidden. In the case of the landslide, in the case of Mr. Unterwurzacher, you can see the landscape, and we can see it even from satellite pictures, more or less at the moment it happens, and you know who's living there, and you can interact, and the communication system is much easier to handle, even if it's a remote village, than it is in the case of a heat wave, where hundreds and thousands of elderly people live in the 5th floor, and the neighbors might notice, but they might not notice. So, to conclude, what I took home from all these lengthy standard discussions done in the preparation phase, and the work we're doing now as meteorologists, being part of giving content to these heat warnings, is that you have to listen to other sectors. You have to listen to understand the problem as a whole, and then you have to act with the eye on the people who are most vulnerable, and you have to act in a way which helps them the most. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. With this, we would like to move on to the next panelist, Professor Gilles Reckinger. He is the former full professor of intercultural communication studies and studies of risk at the University of Innsbruck, but now currently is the academic director of the Institut Supérieur de l'Économie in Luxembourg. He brought with him the person most at risk as a person working in the southern part of Italy in the orange plantations. That person would be between 20 and 40 years old and has no housing. He lives in a slum and has no access to hygienic facilities, has no working contract, often even no papers. So he's an illegal migrant and will have to send still remittances at home, mostly to his family in Africa. Racist programs occur on a regular basis that would victimize and vulnerarize the person even more. The biggest threat of this person are cold or wet weather or fire, which can and quite often bring their existence to the limit. The capacity of these persons to respond or prevent disasters is very limited. With this, I would like to hand over to Mr. Gilles Reckinger.
Thank you so much. These migrant workers, mostly from African countries in South Italy, would normally not be included or represented in the development of a DRR strategy because they do not exist officially as a person in Italy, although their presence is shaped by Italian and also European political decisions. In our context of anthropological, empirical, ethnographical research, we address the vulnerability and exposure to hazard of these persons by recognizing that it is their specific condition they are being brought into by European political decisions that is exposing them to a high risk of vulnerability. One reason for this is that irregular, illegalized or undocumented migrants are very often seen as mere passive receivers of aid as a result of a racist and paternalistic bias. Another point can be identified in the Mediterranean Sea. Both people in the Mediterranean live through situations that look and feel like disaster or hazard. But we need to keep in mind that their condition is man-made and that a treatment of this topic in a logic of disaster management is counterproductive because while trying on one hand to combat symptoms, it really veils the ongoing urgency to find European inclusive solutions that take into account the European labour market demands, demographic realities, and first and foremost, its human rights tradition and heritage. It is crucial to acknowledge that the vulnerability of refugees, both people and documented illegalized migrants, is not an essential characteristic of this group, like a natural category. Holding on to this conception would mean to essentialize what really is a social condition. It would also conceive as an exception a reality that has always been part of human societies, the fact that there are people on the move and in consequence newcomers in a social order already established. Referring to the first point of the 2017 European Forum for Disaster Risk Reduction in Istanbul, and in necessary opposition to a growing attitude in society and governments that consider migration an anomaly, it is essential to, let me cite here, request authorities to include representatives of communities, especially persons with disabilities, refugees, migrants, and so on, and other vulnerable groups in national and local strategies for disaster risk reduction through a participatory and human rights-based approach, etc. So what we should do is first to acknowledge their presence in Europe in specific zones, cities and communities. Secondly, to end marginalization and illegalization by granting access to housing, labor markets and enforcing human rights. For example, the inhabitants of the 2,000 persons tent city in Rosarno, for instance, they told me that the authorities will not help them if their employer refuses to pay their salary, arguing that there is no legal basis for their occupation, whereas it is really the employer who is in charge of establishing correct working contracts. And they also told me that if they call an ambulance in Rosarno, it will refuse to come because the 2,000 inhabitants of the tent city have no official address. The same goes for the firefighters. Third point, drop the what is called in Italian emergenzialismo when dealing with refugees and migrants. The case of the boat migrants on the one hand and the related emergence of slave-like labor markets on the fruit and vegetable plantations in South Italy and in other places of Europe, with their consequences on housing and the vulnerability that results from it, show that Italy's and Europe's governance of the reality of boat migration as an emergency has really prevented them from analyzing that its reasons are structural, and that they thus need inclusive, solidarity strategies to find long-term solutions. After all, boat migration started already in the 1990s. So the question is how to communicate alarms and risks so that they are also understood and followed by this vulnerable group. Here again, we need to acknowledge that refugees and migrants live in the same 21st century than we do, and that their ability to connect with each other and use IT, social networks, etc., is obviously the same than ours, whoever we may be. Of course, one should take care to spread the word within migrant and refugee communities without falling into paternalistic patterns of communication. Remember that many refugees, boat migrants, etc., have lived through and coped with disastrous situations hard to imagine for the average Western decision maker before reaching Europe. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for these words about the situation of migrants and illegal migrants in Italy and in whole Europe. I think we have seen a certain pattern on which parts of community are excluded, migrants, the elderly, people living in remote areas where it's difficult to reach out. And on the other hand, we have as well realized that some of the threats like climate change, causing very dry weathers where it's very difficult to fight, for example, fires, or the sheer kind of intensity and frequency of landslides. And with this kind of, I would like to give over to the last speaker of the panel that comes from Turkey, that has to deal with an increasing influx of Syrian refugees. I mean, it will be a big problem, and he knows that problem very well because he was a former general manager of the Red Crescent in Turkey. Today, he's the president of the Prime Minister's Disaster and Emergency Management Authority, AFAD. Please, Mr. Mehmet Güllüoğlu. Yes.
Yeah, for the panelists, to be the last speaker is not easy, but first of all, I want to ask one question. Can I see the hands who is not from civil protection, who is not from disaster management, who is not from engineering sector? Okay, it means that the rest of them are from civil protection, from disaster management, and which is close to this area. Why I asked, in fact, I hadn't written things to share, but first of all, I'm coming from a medical background. I'm a medical doctor, and I practice medical doctor in ambulances, in emergency services, and as GP. In health sector, when we discuss about health sector, we understood, first of all, there are doctors, there are hospitals, there are patients, but there is something wrong. Because when we look at the health itself, it's first of all human, and the food, and then city, the lifestyle, sport, I mean moving, psychology, family, and other parameters are also which should be discussed when we look at the health. But when it becomes sector, then the patients, then the buildings, then the equipments comes in the front. I think in disaster management, when we discuss about DRR, when we discuss about disaster itself, when we are discussing technically, of course, we are discussing about search and rescue, about fire brigades, about equipments, about DRR activities, the policies, macro policies. But in a topic like what we are discussing today, I mean, what we are discussing now, I think we should be making much more broad environments. Because for elderlies, for disabled people, for migrants, lots of different islands, lots of different planets of groups of people are working together. But they are working in another island, we are working in another island. That's why for disaster management and for DRR activities, even DRR is a big topic like health. There is no health congress or conference are happening. Now there is an ophthalmology congress are happening or gynecology congress are happening. In DRR also it's very broad. In our area, that inclusive and equality-based DRR activities, I think one of the things which we should do, if we can gather other ministries, other stakeholders really on the table, who are experts in other areas of these vulnerable groups, who are experts in migrants, who are experts in different disciplines, will be one of the important success I think it should be. And as a second point I want to share, for disaster management, including DRR, I think we should manage three different things also. One of them is, it is budget management. Because we should make believe other ministries and also Minister of Finance especially, that if we can really spend that needed amount of money for the other activities, then we can save that money. We can save, and by the way, we should be successful about accounting how much we can save. Second, it's about time management. The things what we are discussing is something about uncertainty. We don't know when it will happen, and when it will happen, in which magnitude or in which scale, in which level. That's why it is really difficult, I think, in this specific area. And the third one is something about emotional management. That's how much we should pause, how much we should tell, and how much we should make the change in people's mind, because it is something about to be scaring or to be feeling relaxed. What is the dose it should be? In Turkey, of course, we are dealing with migrants, refugees, and also elderlies, and also, different vulnerable groups. I don't want to impose or advertise about what we are doing, but as just one thing, I think we should be touching that for voluntariness, because for entering into the veins of the cities, to the rural areas, to the far places, than capitals, I think voluntariness that we should be investing and working a lot much more. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That gives us time to come to the audience and to the questions. And I know that you have already been introduced to the assistant pigeonhole where you can submit questions, and we'll have a mix of questions from the audience and from the screen. I would like to start with the colleague here sitting in front, please. And is there a microphone in the room? Should be. It's coming. Welcome.
Buongiorno,
Good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to speak here. I am from the firefighters in Italian. In Italy, we do everything dealing with the urgent technical support, and within the system of civil protection, we work in urgent help during catastrophes. I would like to say a few words on our experience in the inclusion matter. The firefighters help people daily. On average, they do 25,000 interventions per year on elderly people or people that are vulnerable, about 50, 70 interventions per day. So to respond to this need that these people have, we have created a policy of engagement of people. So we have engaged in operative decisions people with disabilities. By putting them together, bringing them together, we created a system that looks at safety of these people with special needs. So other stakeholders are part of this system other than the firefighters. We have created a path that led these people to have a slogan, to have a motto. No, it's not "no one left behind," but I help you to help me. And for us, this is very important because we have trained firefighters with the contribution that these people have given us. A person with disability or a mother of a children which has autism goes to a firefighters and explains them how to relate, how to communicate with their children. So you will find in Italy firefighters that can communicate through images or gestures with people who have autism. You will find firefighters that know sign language so that they can communicate with people with deaf people. So this is our model that we would like to propose, because the logic is that helping people or to do safety on different levels in a uniform system that really considers the safety of everyone is the target that whoever deals with safety has to consider. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's take another question from the audience.
Thank you very much, Nicole. My name is Gianluca Silvestrini from the Council of Europe, and I represent the European and Mediterranean major hazard agreements. Actually, I don't have a question. I have mainly an information for all the participants. As you know, the Council of Europe is a human rights-based organization, and we apply a very inclusive approach. Migrants, of course, is one of the major concerns. And we have been working with the IOM, with the International Organization of Migrants, to develop this publication on migrants in disaster risk reduction, practices for inclusion. You have concrete examples on the importance and added value to include migrants, asylum seekers, and refugees in policy and strategies for disaster risk reduction. This publication is available outside the room, just on this exit door on your right-hand side. If you don't want to bring weight with you, it's of course available also on our website. We are also supporting concrete projects. Mehmet is aware we have been funding projects on the border with Syria in the refugee camps. You have many women and many children that are at risk of fires in the refugee camps. So we have been translating leaflets in Arabic and also provided training to train refugees that they can become trainers as well, of course in Arabic, to prevent possible fire disasters in the camp. The second activity on vulnerable groups is with people with disabilities. Again, we have developed a toolkit. You can see this orange cover page is available outside. You can find concrete guidelines on how to better understand the special needs of disability people and how to integrate their needs in strategies and policies. We have also developed a recommendation for the Council of Europe is a soft law, providing concrete guidelines for the member states to integrate their needs in the policy and strategies. Again, I invite you to pick up this publication outside. And last, gender equality is a very important priority for the Council of Europe. Yesterday, in the dedicated session to the gender equality, our Azzeri rapporteur has presented our strategy to streamline gender equality in all the activities related to disaster risk reduction. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like now to take one of the questions from the Pigeonhole, and I find it very interesting, the question on what's the difference between being vulnerable and being marginalized. And may I ask you, Mr. Gilles Reckinger, to give your thoughts about this? Thank you.
Well, when it comes to undocumented migrants, at least, vulnerability is a consequence of marginalization, and marginalization being a result itself of medial, political and social discourses leading to a relegation of migrant groups from the public sphere of the polis, which again accentuates this, their vulnerability. From here then it's a vicious circle, because then vulnerability will further marginalize, further vulnerizing them and so on.
Thank you. And then let's take another one that is directly asked to Kirsty. How far your findings regarding vulnerable groups incorporated in disaster management practice? May I ask you to respond to this question?
So we're quite close to the beginning of our conversations on this. It was over summer that quite a lot of the research has taken place. However, we're working on the strategy. And we've already started having quite a lot of conversations, particularly around, for example, if we use the example of Razia, looking at where those strengths in community are, making those connections between community groups and planners, looking at things like translators, information in other languages, also wider resilience issues, so whether we can look into, for example, access to digital information, training for older people, working with them to explain what to do and to further strengthen those communities as well. But it is an ongoing process at the moment.
Yes, may I ask you, Mr. Wiss? Yep.
My name is Horst Kremers. I'm from Berlin, Germany, and I just want to suggest that we see all these humanitarian aspects that all speakers so drastically talked about. And I just want to suggest that we don't only make it part of the strategies, but finally, in practice, it would need to maybe give some guidelines for national reporting. You see, national reports on the implementation process and result. It would be nice to have certain chapters needed there. For instance, the chapter on these aspects, not to skip it, because we all know that not all people like to touch these problems too much. So if it's mandatory, it would be nice to have that in the reports, and along with that also in the peer review processes. If peer review is just one peer who does not do it and the other peer who also does not do this, then we wouldn't have control on that. That is deficit management. Just recently in Germany, there was a discussion with ministry representatives that said it's known that there is so much financial demand in personnel, equipment and everything, and these kind of deficits that are even mentioned in the States, they should be documented for everyone. Yes, our citizens should know there is a lot of deficits and we should do something about that. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this input. Maybe is there a reaction from the panel on reporting? Okay. He's right, I hear from here.
No, the indicators for the reporting, no, they foresee this, that you look at the most vulnerable groups, no? Just the data in many countries aren't there. That's the main problem. No?
Okay, I would like to address now a question to Mr. Nazarzoda. There is a question how we can improve civil society engagement in disaster risk reduction governance, especially addressing specific needs of persons with disabilities. You already mentioned some aspects during your speech, but maybe you can add some more words on this question here. And maybe I repeat it once more so that translation can be done in Russian. How can we improve the civil society engagement in disaster risk reduction governance, especially for addressing the specific needs of persons with disabilities?
Большое спасибо.
Thank you for the question. As I said, our country is full of mountains, and so when there are a certain situations, certain emergency situation and disasters, of course, those people who have limited possibilities, such as disabled people and children and women, are the ones that are most exposed to risks. We, with our colleagues, have spoken about the inclusion theme, the inclusion topic. So, of course, there is also a difference of mentality in our country because we live in these conditions. We have a lot of mountains, so we also have a different approach to those people who are the most in need. So when there are these emergency situations, regardless of the rules and what is written, we try to give assistance to the population that need assistance in the first place. So in terms of what can be done to improve, of course, we must improve education. We must train those people who have limited possibility on how to behave in such situations. So also we have to train volunteers and experts and all those giving assistance. So it is by training those people that we can give a more effective tool to these people who need special assistance. Thank you for your attention.
Is there another question from the audience? May I ask you, please?
Sono Giampiero Griffo.
My name is Giampiero Griffo. I represent the European Disability Forum, and the topic of disability is not hidden anymore. But we must use the right words. In our opinion, we don't use vulnerability word, but marginalization and marginalized. I'm not vulnerable. I am vulnerated because up to 10 years ago, no one actually addressed this target group. Since we every day we are resilient, we are experts in terms of dealing with disasters, and the Sendai Agreement says this very clearly. The participation of organizations of disabled people, as Mr. Zanut said, is fundamental, because now the problem that we are discussing at the UN is drafting some guidelines to include disabled people within the humanitarian interventions, because the Istanbul Charter was drafted was taken after the Humanitarian Forum to become a work tool. So disability is part of us. If we go and see within the lifetime, everyone will live a disabled condition. So to operate for this group is not just to give them attention, to give attention to a minority, but is actually useful for the whole society. So I would like to ask the panel how much you involve organization of disabled people in planning interventions and implementing such interventions and further management after first aid.
Yes, thank you very much for your question. May I ask you, maybe Mr. Staudingher, on the experience in Austria on including disability organizations into the planning and response of disaster management?
There's a dialogue going on between the members of the platform and disability organizations, but you're completely right, this dialogue could be improved. And we're working on it, but I think it's very good that the Center framework gives a starting point, but it's up to all of us to continue on this path.
And as it seems an important question, maybe I ask the experience from Turkey.
In fact, to tell the truth, it's not on the level of what it should be. Even that's why I'm also saying that other organizations should be on the table. But when we look at, Turkey's experience or other organizations, it is not in the level that it should be. Because, as I said, there are silos, there are vertical silos, but I think we should have a much more horizontal, aim-based approach.
Thank you very much. The topic still needs to be further improved. Even so, I believe as well that there has been an improvement looking kind of 10 years ago to now, but kind of putting words into action is definitely as well here the topic that it's not only on the paper, but it comes really reality. I would like to address a very last question that is a bit difficult for me to see on the screen because it is cut, but it has the 13 votes, and it is about how to bridge academic research on social, on social vulnerability and DRR, on how can we bridge the gap between research and policymakers to enhance effective DRR for vulnerable groups. And if I would like to once more address to the kind of science person here at the table and how that could be done.
I obviously have to take this question because I have to deal with it almost every day in my research work and in my teaching too. I think what is primordial is that we exit alarmist discourses brought on by the media and fueling populism, which leads to a habitus. We have really habitualized it that we take merely immediate responses to things that are being identified as crisis. And that leads little to no time for reflection or exchange between academia, because academia, the research world, is a world that is per definitionem slow. We have to look closely at things, so we need time, right? And that is why we should really strive to understand how things have become the way they are. To quote the German sociologist Max Weber, which means to include many perspectives, to strengthen multilateralism, and not to give in to the oversimplification brought on by populists who use the acceleration of our time to bring on alarmist discourses, emergenzialismo, come si dice in italiano.
Thank you. Maybe I still would like to ask as well from the practical side, where I would like to address once more the Turkey on how you learn from.
In fact, with some specific universities, we are also in touch. But I think the question itself also, puts a fact that not all of the academical research are implemented. It's also related with budget, but not also budget, other barriers. One of the important things is, I think, it's very much linked with the previous question. The demand from the civil society, the demand from the bottom, which also will make that there are academical facts, there are academical methods that will guide our policymakers. But for the policymakers, it is not only the way that, okay, now let's look at what academicians are saying that we will do that. No, it's not like that. That's why for changing the policy, for asking from the bottom and pushing from the bottom, it will be, I think, much more, will be bridge the gap between academical facts and the methods and the guides, and also for policymakers.
Thank you. And may I ask, building up on this question, maybe the very last question to Michael Staudingher once more. Here it's about inclusion, and on the other hand, we know that there is a wealth of information from academia on climate change, and how that's made policy relevant in disaster risk reduction, or isn't. Is the research on climate change, is that leading to action, or is it kind of just remaining on paper?
It's a very difficult thing to bring scientific results into political action, but it's happening in all the countries. In Austria, a strategy for climate change, for combating climate change, has been just developed and published. Implementation is the problem. To develop a strategy is one thing, what should be done, but then to really do it, it needs a transformation of the whole society, a complete transformation of society. But the more people talk about, the more it has a scientific foundation, and the more the media and all of us bring the topic forward, the bigger the chances are that we can mitigate consequences of climate change. And we easily tend to delegate this to the so-called decision makers and think these are the politicians. Decision makers are all of us. And it's the tyranny of these many millions and billions of small decisions which everybody, all of us, take all the time, which go either this way or that way if you talk about climate change and the measures which have to be taken.
I believe that is a very nice kind of final word. It depends on our decisions at the local level and on everyday life. It depends definitively as well on other decisions on a higher level, but bringing those decisions on the different levels together in order to make the world safer and protect the life of people, that would be kind of the concluding remark of this plenary session. I would like to thank once more to the panelists here on the podium for their interesting, and as well to the keynote speaker of their interesting presentation. Thank you very much.